Little baby. Ooh. Give me those. Give me those toes. Give me those toes. Give me your baby. Give me your baby. Give me your baby.
It's hard to imagine how this child's death could be any more traumatic.
I'm gonna miss her.
She didn't make a sound, no cry, no breath, no heartbeat. That's how the call began, not from a neighbor, not from a bystander, but from her father. Calm, measured, detached. Inside a bare apartment with no heat, no lights, and no working water, a 10-month-old baby girl was found lying motionless, lying still on a mattress. There were no immediate signs of distress, no visible injuries, but something about the scene didn't add up. The water was still. The diaper was clean. The story didn't match the evidence, and while medical teams worked urgently to help her, he, her father, stood off to the side. Not in panic, not in tears, but silent, watching, waiting, as if the outcome was already known. Her name was Zara Lynn Scruggs, and she was days away from turning 1. This wasn't a case of neglect. It wasn't a tragic accident. What unfolded next forced prosecutors, detectives, and even the community to ask the same devastating question. How could something so wrong go unnoticed for so long? Before we continue, please be advised, this case includes deeply emotional material involving a child. We share it with care, not for shock, but to raise awareness, protect the innocent, and remind every viewer why speaking up matters. To those of you who have stood with us, thank you. Your support, your shares, your voices in the comments have helped these stories reach more people than we ever imagined. You're not just viewers, you're advocates. And if you're new here, welcome. We see you. And we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments and consider subscribing if you believe in justice and the power of awareness. Every time you click, comment, or share, you're helping this story matter. Because when we stay informed, we stay vigilant. And when we speak out, we give a voice to those who no longer can. Now let's go back to the day Zara smiled for the last time. Zara Lynn Scruggs was born on December 1st, 2019. Her family called her Moo, a name that stuck, like nicknames often do, with no special reason beyond love. She was expressive, full of energy, and captivated those around her with her wide eyes and infectious smile. Her presence brought joy to everyone in the room, especially to her mother, Erica Scruggs. Erica was attentive, present, and deeply connected to her daughter. Those who knew her say she centered her life around Zara. Every milestone mattered. Every small moment, from Zara's first steps to her love for music, was carefully documented by a mother who saw nothing more important than raising her little girl. Zara's father, Austin Stevens, was also in the picture. At 29, he was seen as someone who had found stability. He coached for the Lower Providence Warriors, a youth football team. He also helped run a construction business, Black Diamond Construction. His outward appearance was one of control, structure, and normalcy. He spoke well, dressed neatly, and had the kind of professional front that didn't attract suspicion. There was nothing in his background that raised concern. No public complaints, no legal trouble. Nothing that suggested he posed any risk to his own child. From the outside, he was a capable co-parent. After Erica and Austin ended their relationship, they agreed to co-parent without going through the court system. It was a mutual decision, informal, based on familiarity and a sense of mutual respect. Zara stayed with her mother full-time, but occasionally spent weekends with her father. That agreement had worked smoothly. There were no major conflicts. No emergency calls, no signs that anything was amiss. When Austin came by to pick up Zara, Erica's family didn't hesitate. Her father, Zara's grandfather, would often greet Austin with a handshake or a smile. On this particular weekend, he handed Zara over without a second thought. At that point, Austin had just moved into a new apartment in Lower Providence. He mentioned that the place was still being set up, that some utilities hadn't been turned on yet. It didn't raise alarms. People move all the time. Temporary inconveniences aren't uncommon. He explained it casually. No one pushed further. The visit wasn't unusual. There were no changes in behavior, no tension, No signals that something wasn't right. In Erica's mind, her daughter was spending time with her father. In her parents' eyes, this was just another routine handoff between co-parents who had made peace with their past. And in that silence, trust filled the space. These types of arrangements are more common than most realize. Many families rely on verbal agreements structured around shared history, goodwill, and the assumption that no parent would ever harm their child. It's often safer to believe in the best, to assume that what looks fine on the outside must be just as safe on the inside. But safety, when unexamined, can become a mask. The illusion of it can blind even the most attentive family, because when something feels familiar, it rarely triggers alarm. That's what makes it so difficult to see. Not because the signs aren't there, but because we're not looking for them. So many families trust, but trust doesn't guarantee safety. If you've ever shared custody or cared for a child, let us know in the comments what signs would worry you. The hardest part of hindsight is realizing the quiet moments were the ones that mattered most. Moments that felt ordinary, even forgettable. And that's what makes this case so difficult. There were no sirens before it began. No warning shots, just the assumption that everything was fine until it wasn't. October 3rd, 2020. It was a Saturday evening in Lower Providence Township, Pennsylvania. Austin Stevens had recently taken up residence in a new apartment located at 3400 Germantown Pike. The apartment was modest and unfurnished. At the time, it lacked some basic utilities. No heating, no hot water, and no working electricity. According to official reports, the indoor temperature hovered around 59 degrees Fahrenheit. Despite those conditions, Austin followed through with plans to have his daughter for the weekend. That evening, he arrived at Erica's parents' home to pick up 10-month-old Zara. The handoff was routine. No one expressed concern. Austin gave no indication that anything was unusual about his apartment or the visit. He took Zara and left. It was supposed to be just another night between a father and his child. What occurred over the next few hours would later be scrutinized in forensic detail, revealing a timeline that raised more questions than answers. Between 9:27 and 10:22 p.m., Austin Stevens was active on his phone. Search logs retrieved by investigators showed a series of concerning queries, phrases that suggest a growing awareness that something wasn't right. They included, "If baby stops breathing? What if you don't hear baby heartbeat? How do you know if a baby is dead?" The search activity didn't take place in isolation. At the very same time, Stevens was also engaged in conversations on social media. Investigators later confirmed he was messaging two different women, engaging in casual conversation, flirting, and sending images of himself. These messages, obtained by law enforcement through warrant, showed no mention of his daughter, no signs of concern, and no request for help. During the investigation, authorities carefully noted the timing of these online interactions. They were sent within minutes of the search queries. He was alternating between looking up urgent medical terms and casually talking to women. The contrast was startling. At 10:40 p.m., Austin called emergency services. In the recorded call, he claimed that his daughter had slipped and hit her head while bathing. He told the dispatcher that he had stepped out of the bathroom momentarily and returned to find her unresponsive. Paramedics were immediately dispatched to the scene. What they found did not match his account. When first responders entered the apartment, they observed that the bathtub was dry. There was no indication that a bath had been run, let alone used recently. Zara was found wearing a diaper and placed on a mattress. The conditions inside the apartment were cold and dim. There was no warmth in the room, no signs of a child-friendly environment, and no obvious evidence that an accident had occurred the way it had been described. More striking, however, was Austin's behavior. According to the paramedics on scene, his demeanor was neutral, unusually calm, almost disconnected. When asked to assist, he made no effort to correct mistakes or clarify what had happened. He stood nearby as resuscitation efforts were underway, offering little verbal or emotional response. Medical personnel began their work, applying standard protocols to stabilize the child and prepare her for immediate transport. Despite their efforts, the situation was critical. Later, when investigators pieced together the timeline, the window between the initial signs of medical distress and the emergency call would become one of the most scrutinized aspects of the case. What was Austin doing during that hour? Why had he waited? And why was his online activity so far removed from the seriousness of the moment? These inconsistencies, both in the physical scene and in his digital behavior, formed the early pillars of the investigation. They did not yet provide a full picture. But they introduced a troubling possibility that something wasn't right long before the phone call was ever made. When something doesn't feel right, don't hesitate to speak up. Even small inconsistencies can mean everything. In cases like this, timing is everything. And the truth often is hiding in what someone didn't say soon enough. October 4th, 2020. Just after midnight. At 12:12 a.m., medical staff formally recorded the time. 10-month-old Zara Scruggs was no longer responsive to any life-saving measures, and she had unfortunately passed away. Hospital records confirmed her arrival had been under urgent conditions. Despite multiple interventions, the outcome was final. The scene was then passed on to investigators for further review. At this point, the case moved into the hands of forensic professionals. Montgomery County's Office of the Coroner assigned the matter to Dr. Frederick Hellman, a seasoned medical examiner with years of experience conducting high-profile forensic reviews. The next phase was clear: determine the official cause and manner of what had occurred. As is standard, a full examination was ordered. The results would later be submitted as part of the case file and presented in legal proceedings. According to Dr. Hellman's findings, the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The manner was ruled a homicide. The medical findings alone were sufficient to raise concern, but they weren't the only pieces of evidence investigators had access to. Law enforcement immediately began working with forensic specialists to compile a timeline based on digital and physical data. One of the first things they did was obtain a search warrant for Austin Stevens' phone. The contents of the device would play a pivotal role in unraveling his claims. Inside the phone's data, investigators uncovered the same internet searches referenced earlier. But this time, they matched them to timestamps and messaging history. The queries for emergency procedures had taken place within an hour before the 911 call. But there was a critical gap. While these searches occurred, Stevens wasn't just browsing for help. He was actively engaged in social conversations with two women on social media platforms. The content of those chats was casual, flirtatious, unrelated to any emergency. This wasn't speculation. The timestamps provided by his own device created a sequence that could be verified second by second. While Zara's condition was declining, Stevens had not called for assistance. Instead, he was alternating between medical search terms and unrelated messages. Further examination of the physical space revealed additional inconsistencies. Among the items collected as evidence was a diaper found near the child's sleeping area. Its condition raised immediate concerns, and it was submitted for forensic analysis. Reports later confirmed it contained biological material that became part of the official case record. That detail alone challenged Stevens' earlier explanation of a fall in the bathtub. The physical evidence and the statement he had given did not align. The digital timeline was what ultimately began to close the gap. By comparing Stevens' device activity, message history, and browser logs, investigators were able to construct a nearly minute-by-minute reconstruction of events leading up to the emergency call. At no point in those exchanges was there a message for help. No call to a friend, no text to a relative, no communication that suggested a parent in panic. The only outreach made to 911 came after the hour had already passed and the search terms had already been entered. When authorities reviewed the evidence, they noted something particularly troubling. Among the messages retrieved from the phone, one stood out. A line sent during the middle of his digital activity, time-stamped and recorded. It showed that Stevens had been aware of his daughter's condition well before the 911 call was placed. And yet, during that same time frame, he had continued his unrelated messaging with no visible sense of urgency. This became the pivot point in the investigation. Everything that followed would rely on this contradiction. A child who needed help, a timeline that showed delay, and a father whose actions didn't reflect the emergency unfolding around him. But one key message on his phone revealed exactly how long he knew and chose not to act. October 6, 2020, just 2 days after the events at the apartment on Germantown Pike, Montgomery County detectives took decisive action. Following a detailed investigation of the scene, interviews with emergency responders, and a forensic review of digital evidence, Austin Stevens was formally arrested. The charges filed against him included aggravated assault, involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, and endangering the welfare of a child. The arrest came swiftly. Authorities stated there was sufficient probable cause based on conflicting statements, inconsistencies at the scene, and the digital trail recovered from his phone. Stevens was processed and held at Montgomery County Correctional Facility. Prosecutors moved to have him held without release, citing the seriousness of the charges and the nature of the investigation. By December 1st, after additional forensic results were submitted and the medical examiner's conclusions were officially entered into the case record, the charges were escalated. Montgomery County District Attorney Kevin R. Steele announced that Stevens would now face additional counts, including first-degree murder and third-degree murder, along with related criminal offenses. Assisting in the prosecution were First Assistant District Attorney Edward F. McCann and Assistant District Attorney Brianna Ringwood. Together, they prepared the case for presentation to the court. In their statement to the press, the team emphasized the strength of the evidence and the urgency of pursuing justice. Bail was set at $1 million. Stevens was denied release. The court cited risk factors and community safety in its ruling. The gravity of the charges, especially in light of the forensic timeline and phone data, left no room for doubt about the path forward. News of the arrest spread quickly. Community members who had once seen Stevens as a reliable coach and business owner now saw headlines they could barely reconcile with the person they thought they knew. Among those who responded publicly was Stevens' own mother. In a powerful statement made to local media, she voiced her complete disapproval of her son's actions. "He is a monster. We do not support him," she said. "We are completely against what he did to my granddaughter." It was a rare moment of clarity in a case filled with deception. The emotional split between personal love and moral accountability was not softened. She chose the child over her son, and she said so without hesitation. Meanwhile, the broader community began to grieve. In the days that followed, friends, family, and even strangers came together to support Zara's mother and extended family. A GoFundMe was launched in Zara's name. Within a short period, over $46,000 was raised. Contributions poured in from across the country. Many left comments expressing sympathy, outrage, and a desire for change. A funeral service was held shortly afterward. More than 500 people attended. The ceremony was filled with photographs, soft music, and shared memories. The outpouring of support was a reflection of how deeply this case had touched the public. People who had never met Zara felt the weight of what was lost. This wasn't just a legal case. It became a wake-up call, a reminder that harm doesn't always come from where it's expected. Sometimes it comes quietly, from someone once welcomed at the door. If your community has ever rallied in response to a crisis, if you've seen neighbors become protectors, share how below. Because when justice begins, it doesn't start in a courtroom. It starts with people paying attention and refusing to look away. October 13th, 2020. Less than 2 weeks after his arrest, Austin Stevens appeared in court for his preliminary hearing. Prosecutors presented the foundational elements of the case: digital records, forensic summaries, and key witness statements. The goal wasn't to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Not yet. It was to demonstrate that the case had sufficient weight to proceed to trial. The presiding judge reviewed the material and agreed. The evidence was compelling. Testimony from investigators pointed to contradictions between Stevens' statements and the physical findings. Search data retrieved from his phone and the timeline surrounding the emergency call were introduced to the court as key pieces of the prosecution's position. The case was bound over for trial. The court then began its slow progression toward a full jury trial. COVID-19 had introduced delays across the entire justice system. Like many other proceedings during that time, this case was impacted. Courtrooms operated at reduced capacity. Hearings were staggered. Timelines extended. By March 2022, the trial was ready to begin. The prosecution opened with a clear and deliberate strategy to show that Stevens not only failed to act when he should have, but that his behavior prior to the emergency call demonstrated full awareness of what was happening. They laid out the timeline, starting with the hours of online activity, the social messaging history, and the delayed 911 call. The digital evidence served as the backbone of their case. Everything had a timestamp. Every action could be placed on a clock. There was no speculation, just patterns. The prosecution also emphasized behavioral inconsistencies. They brought in paramedics who responded that night, investigators who observed Stevens' demeanor, and medical professionals who treated Zara upon arrival. The testimony was methodical, calm. Each witness relayed what they saw, what they were told, and what didn't add up. After several days of witness examination, the defense responded. Their strategy focused on suggesting that while the situation was tragic, it wasn't intentional. They attempted to reframe the timeline as reactive rather than deliberate. That the online searches and delays could be explained by confusion, fear, a lack of medical knowledge. But the evidence didn't support confusion. It documented decision-making, repeated measured delays, a complete absence of communication with anyone, until it was too late. On the final day of proceedings, the jury was sent to deliberate. The weight of the charges was significant. First-degree murder, involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, endangering the welfare of a child. Each charge carried its own standard of proof. Each required the jury to consider intent, knowledge, and actions. They returned in just 90 minutes. The verdict, guilty on all counts. There was no public statement from Stevens. He declined to take the stand. He also declined the opportunity to speak before sentencing. He remained silent as the judge issued the final decision. The sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Courtroom observers noted that Stevens showed no visible emotion. He was escorted from the courtroom by deputies without resistance. No appeal was filed at the time of sentencing. The decision was final. For those watching, it wasn't just a conclusion. It was confirmation that the system had listened, that every log file, every forensic record, every delay that was once just a suspicion had become evidence. And that evidence became accountability. If you believe sentencing alone doesn't bring closure, but awareness can, consider subscribing to help spread prevention. Because justice doesn't just happen in a courtroom. It starts with attention, and it continues with people who care enough to keep talking about it. In the months following the trial, there was no legislative overhaul, no sweeping policy changes. But something else happened, something quieter, and in many ways, just as meaningful. Parents began having conversations they hadn't had before. Conversations about safety, about trust, and about the risks that don't always come with a warning label. Zara's case, though painful, reached people. It circulated not through headlines alone, but through personal posts, private messages, and online forums where parents and caregivers began reevaluating their own lives. They weren't just asking what happened. They were asking how to prevent something similar from ever happening again. Local parenting groups and child advocacy communities began organizing sessions, not to revisit the case, but to use it as a starting point. Discussions were held about informal custody arrangements and how easy it is to overlook risk when familiarity creates a false sense of security. It wasn't about blame. It was about awareness. One recurring theme emerged again and again: invisible risk. When two parents share custody without court involvement, they're often operating on trust, and in most cases that works. But when there's no oversight, no documentation, and no external accountability, it creates a space where problems can go unnoticed until it's too late. Zara's case brought that concern into focus, not just for legal professionals, but for ordinary families who had always assumed they were doing the right thing. The hashtag Justice for Zara began appearing across social media. It wasn't tied to a formal campaign. It wasn't launched by a nonprofit. It started organically. Parents, neighbors, and even strangers posting in remembrance and in reflection. Stories were shared by people who said they now double-check pickup routines, who ask more questions about who's watching their children, and who trust their instincts a little more than they used to. The impact wasn't loud. It was personal, measured in quiet changes, extra conversations, and moments where someone paused just long enough to ask, "Is this really okay?" There are a few clear takeaways, simple yet powerful. First, custody arrangements, even between people who once cared deeply for each other, should be documented. Not out of distrust, but out of respect for structure. When boundaries are clear, safety is easier to maintain. Second, it's vital to monitor how trusted individuals interact with children, not through suspicion, but through observation. Subtle behavioral changes in caregivers, signs of detachment, unusual defensiveness, or even just a lack of interest in regular routines can all be early indicators that deserve attention. And finally, it's important to maintain open communication with children in a way that's age-appropriate. Even toddlers can express discomfort through behavior, reluctance, or emotional shifts. Caregivers and educators alike should be trained to recognize those patterns. The most important safeguards don't always come from systems or statutes. They come from people staying alert, from communities that check in, not just during a crisis, but before one has the chance to take root. From families willing to have hard conversations, even when it feels uncomfortable. Zara's name has become more than a headline. It has become a reminder that harm doesn't always arrive with warning signs, that danger can present itself wearing a familiar face, and that silence, especially when something feels off, can cost more than anyone is prepared to lose. The legacy left behind is one of prevention, one that calls for vigilance in everyday decisions, for accountability, even within families, and for protecting children not just through love, but through structure, awareness, and responsible action. Because in the end, what protects a child isn't just affection. It's attention, it's boundaries, and it's the willingness to act before hindsight becomes the only thing left. Zara's story is not just about what happened inside one apartment on one night. It's about how something that seemed ordinary on the outside concealed choices that changed everything. It's about how harm can come from places no one expects, from people no one questions. This case exposed how easily appearances can create false comfort, how silence, when paired with misplaced trust, can delay action until it's too late. There were no obvious warning signs, no system alert, no record that predicted what would unfold. And that's exactly why it must be remembered. Because Zara's name now stands for more than a case. It stands for awareness. It stands for every parent who double-checks, every teacher who pays closer attention, and every community that refuses to stay quiet when something feels off. Every guardian, every relative, every caregiver carries a responsibility to notice, to act, and to protect, even when the threat isn't loud or visible. Your awareness could save a life. Subscribe to be part of a growing community that speaks when others stay silent. And if you've made it this far, leave a heart in Zara's memory.
Do you feel the system failed your granddaughter?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. They failed my son, my granddaughter, our family, all of us. They're failing other children, too. You know, and it needs to stop. It really does. My son was one of the people that was calling in. Maybe that's why they didn't do anything. I don't know.
8-month-old girl was tragically murdered in June of 2023. And whereas Corporal Brandon Hallowich was assigned to the homicide investigation of Iris Rita Alfera, and whereas on January 11, 2024, an arrest was made in connection with the death of Iris Rita Alfera, and whereas Corporal Brandon Hallowich was able to find critical information that led to this arrest And whereas, without the extraordinary efforts of Corporal Brandon Hallowich, this case may have not been solved.
She was just 18 months old, and her tiny frame barely filled the hospital bed. Machines beeped softly in the background as doctors and nurses worked frantically. But the reality was clear. The odds were stacked against her. What no one knew in that moment was that her suffering hadn't started that day, and it should have been prevented long before she arrived at that emergency room. The explanation given was simple. A short fall, a minor accident. But when seasoned paramedics stepped into the quiet home hours earlier, something felt terribly wrong. The details didn't line up. There was no evidence of a fall severe enough to cause the injuries they were seeing. No panic. No urgency from the adults who should have been beside themselves. Just silence and excuses that didn't match the reality in front of them. Days later, the unthinkable happened, and as detectives peeled back the layers of this case, they would uncover a string of missed warnings, overlooked reports, and decisions that placed a vulnerable child directly in harm's way. How could this happen? How could a child who had already endured a life-threatening incident be sent right back into the same situation? Why did those in charge ignore the alarms ringing around them? The answers would devastate a family, outrage a community, and force an uncomfortable question. Was this tragedy truly unforeseeable, or was it the direct result of a system that failed to do its job? What you are about to hear is disturbing. But this is more than a story about one child. It's about a deeply broken system and the innocent lives it puts at risk. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. We cover real cases that matter and push for the change these children desperately needed. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and time, because this helps us to know when best to reach you with these videos. We read and respond to as many as we can. To our returning subscribers, thank you for your incredible support. Your likes, shares, and thoughtful comments are the reason we can keep shining a light on stories that must be told. Iris Rita Alfera was born on December 2, 2021 in Butler, Pennsylvania, a child who immediately became the center of her family's world. Her mother, Emily Alfera, was a young woman devoted to giving her daughter a safe and loving home. Emily's parents, Candace and Frank Alfera, shared that devotion, welcoming Iris into their house from the very beginning. Their home was warm, stable, and filled with the laughter of a child whose presence brought a new sense of purpose to the entire family. Iris was known for her bright eyes and constant curiosity. She was a quick learner who loved to explore the world around her. By her first birthday, she had already become fascinated by educational children's programs, especially the popular Miss Rachel videos. She would watch them closely, trying to mimic the songs and hand motions, a habit that brought constant smiles to her family. She was the kind of child who could light up a room simply by entering it.
Well, she has a mouthful. Good job. Happy to mommy. Sing to mommy. Happy. You're supposed to sing. Sing to mommy.
Emily enjoyed dressing her daughter in matching outfits, often sharing pictures of the two of them on social media. Whether it was coordinating dresses in the summer or identical sweaters in the winter, these photos captured the close bond between mother and child.
I will be putting this baby in a pumpkin. I will be purchasing a large pumpkin, cutting a hole in the top, cutting 2 holes for legs, and I will be putting her in a pumpkin and taking 50 to 1,000 photos and putting those photos on Instagram. And if you have a baby and you're not putting that baby in a pumpkin, I am calling CPS.
Iris was also close to her grandparents, who were deeply involved in her daily care. Candace and Frank doted on her, filling their house with toys and activities that encouraged her natural curiosity. Though Emily and Iris's father, Bailey Jacoby, were no longer in a relationship, they worked out a visitation schedule that allowed Bailey to remain part of his daughter's life. He would see Iris regularly, taking her for visits on certain weekdays and weekends. To those who knew the family, it seemed like a cooperative arrangement designed to keep Iris connected to both sides of her family. The picture of Iris's young life was one of love and security. She was surrounded by people who adored her and wanted the best for her. To her family, she wasn't just a child, she was a source of joy, the promise of a future they looked forward to nurturing. None of them could have imagined how quickly that future would be taken away. In late February 2023, the first troubling signs began to surface. To fully understand what happened next, it's important to know who was closely involved in Iris's life at the time. Her father, Bailey Jacoby, was in a relationship with a young woman named Alicia Owens. Alicia, in her early 20s, lived with Bailey and was regularly around during Iris's visits. She was often part of the daily care the toddler received whenever she stayed at her father's home. With that context, the seriousness of what unfolded next becomes even clearer. During a routine diaper change after a weekend visit, Emily noticed something alarming in Iris's stool. Small, jelly-like beads that clearly didn't belong. Soon after, Iris began showing signs of discomfort, and Emily feared she might have swallowed other objects. She rushed her daughter to the hospital, desperate for answers. Doctors quickly discovered that Iris had ingested more than 20 water-absorbing beads, a small metal screw, and 3 button batteries. The situation was critical. Medical staff immediately understood the danger and began treatment without delay. Emily Alfera was shaken and confused. She told doctors and hospital staff that these items could not have come from her home. Emily had always been careful about her daughter's environment, and her parents, Candace and Frank, supported that statement. Their house was child-proofed, and Iris was closely supervised. Emily's insistence sparked questions that no one seemed able to answer. How could a toddler gain access to such items during a short visit elsewhere? Around this time, investigators would later uncover troubling evidence about Alicia Owens. On February 28th, Alicia used her phone to search for topics that raised immediate concerns. She wanted to know which household products could harm a baby. In the days that followed, she continued her searches, asking questions like whether sunscreen could harm a 1-year-old and what symptoms appeared if a child swallowed a battery. By early April, Alicia's internet history showed even more disturbing activity. She searched for water beads available near me, followed by questions about the effects of acetone and nail polish remover on children. These searches painted a deeply concerning picture. Yet at the time, no one was aware of this pattern. On April 5th, Emily, still alarmed after the February hospitalization, went to court. She filed an emergency request before Judge David Acri, asking for supervised visitation for Iris's father. Emily feared for her daughter's safety and pleaded with the court to intervene. Judge Acri denied the request. Instead, he ordered that the parents attend co-parenting classes, keeping the existing visitation schedule in place. Lawrence County Children and Youth Services was also involved. They conducted checks at both Emily's and Bailey's homes, but their reviews were cursory. Boxes were checked, forms were filled out, and the matter was closed. No one pressed further on how a toddler could have swallowed so many dangerous objects during a weekend visit. This was a missed opportunity. Had the warning signs been fully investigated and acted upon, Iris's fate might have been very different. Have you ever seen warning signs ignored? Let us know respectfully in the comments. Your voice helps others recognize the signs before it's too late. In the weeks that followed, subtle but significant warning signs began to appear again. By mid-June 2023, Alicia Owens' behavior, though hidden from public view, was becoming more concerning. On June 20th, digital evidence later revealed that she conducted yet another search on her phone, this time asking how a condition known as shaken baby syndrome occurs. This type of query, combined with her prior history of similar searches, painted a troubling picture about what was going on behind closed doors. Meanwhile, Emily Alfera's fears for her daughter's safety continued to grow. She confided in family members about her concerns, sharing how powerless she felt. Friends and relatives recalled Emily voicing her anxiety, but she had already been warned by officials that if she violated the existing custody order or refused to comply with visitations, she could risk losing custody altogether. That threat left her with few options. She was determined to protect Iris, yet constrained by the legal system that demanded she follow the schedule in place. At the same time, tensions within the dynamic between Alicia Owens and Emily Alfera were escalating. Those close to the family later said Alicia appeared jealous of the cooperative relationship Emily and Bailey maintained for the sake of their daughter. Emily and Bailey regularly communicated about Iris, sending updates and photos back and forth during visits. Investigators would later note how Alicia's resentment of that connection may have been growing. What no one realized was how dangerous that underlying tension could become. June 23rd and 24th were scheduled visitation days. Iris went to her father's home as planned, and to those who saw her, nothing seemed outwardly amiss. The toddler appeared to be her usual self, smiling and playing, showing no clear signs that anything was wrong. Family members could not have imagined that these were the final ordinary moments they would ever see. But beneath the surface, the situation was becoming increasingly volatile. Alicia Owens' actions, though largely invisible to outsiders, were setting the stage for tragedy. Emily's worries remained unanswered, the court order left unchanged, and the existing visitation arrangements continued as before. And then came Sunday, June 25th, the last day Iris would ever be seen alive outside of a hospital. Sunday, June 25th, 2023, began like any other scheduled visitation day. That morning, Bailey Jacoby left his Newcastle home to run errands, leaving his 18-month-old daughter Iris in the care of his girlfriend Alicia Owens. From the outside, it may have seemed like a routine arrangement, but what happened over the next few hours would end in unimaginable loss. Sometime that afternoon, Alicia would later claim Iris had fallen off a bed while she was in another room. According to her account, the toddler had been playing and had tumbled onto the floor. But when first responders arrived at the home, they quickly realized the situation didn't match the story they were given. Paramedics noted that Iris was unresponsive when they reached the residence. The environment struck them as oddly still. There was no visible panic from Alicia, no urgency as she explained what had supposedly happened. For seasoned responders, this lack of reaction raised immediate concerns. A minor fall from a low surface could not reasonably account for the child's condition. Iris was rushed to Jameson Hospital in Newcastle, where emergency staff worked to stabilize her. Doctors quickly recognized how grave her situation was. After several hours of fighting to maintain her vital signs, they made the decision to transfer her to UPMC Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, a specialized facility equipped to handle complex pediatric cases. At UPMC, a team of pediatric critical care specialists immediately took over. They worked on Iris around the clock, running multiple diagnostic tests to determine what had caused her rapid deterioration. Early findings suggested that her condition was not the result of a simple fall. Imaging studies showed signs consistent with violent shaking or forceful impact. Toxicology screens would later confirm the presence of acetone in her system, a chemical commonly found in household products. Doctors at UPMC Children's Hospital worked tirelessly for 4 days to try and save Iris. Despite their best efforts, her condition never stabilized. She had suffered severe internal complications that her small body could not overcome. Medical experts explained that her brain and other vital organs had sustained extensive damage, making recovery impossible. Toxicology tests also confirmed the presence of a dangerous chemical, acetone, in her system, further complicating her fragile state. This combination of factors left doctors with no viable options. By June 29th, it was clear that there was nothing more they could do. During those long, agonizing days, Iris's family remained at the hospital. Her mother, Emily Alfera, and grandparents, Candace and Frank, stayed by her bedside, clinging to hope. Nurses recalled how they whispered encouragement to the toddler, telling her how much she was loved. family members took turns stepping out of the room to compose themselves, struggling to process how a seemingly ordinary weekend visit had led to this. On June 29th, after 4 days of intensive care, the doctors delivered the devastating news that Iris Rita Alfera had passed away. Despite every intervention available, Iris's condition had not improved. Emily collapsed into her parents' arms as the words sank in, while other relatives wept quietly nearby. One nurse later described the scene as one of profound heartbreak, the kind that stays with a hospital team long after the case ends. The loss shattered the family. They left UPMC that day with more questions than answers, devastated by a reality they had never imagined. What had really happened to Iris in the hours before she was found unresponsive? And why had earlier warning signs been ignored? If this story already feels important, please subscribe now, because what investigators discovered next wasn't just shocking, it could have been prevented. The investigation into what happened to Iris intensified as soon as it became clear her injuries were not consistent with the explanation given. Detectives from the Newcastle Police Department secured the home where she had been found and began piecing together the evidence. One of the first steps was obtaining a search warrant for Alicia Owen's phone, a device investigator believed could hold critical answers. When the data was analyzed, the results were startling. Alicia's internet history contained a series of troubling searches spanning from February through June 2023. She had looked up questions about how household products could harm a child, the effects of various chemicals, and what symptoms would appear if a young child swallowed certain items. Investigators also discovered deleted searches, including how to pass a lie detector test. These findings pointed to a deliberate pattern of behavior rather than a one-time accident. Meanwhile, forensic pathologists conducted a full examination to determine the exact cause of death. Their findings confirmed that acetone poisoning had caused multiple organ failure, which ultimately took Iris's life. Further examination of her injuries revealed trauma consistent with deliberate harm, not an accidental fall. These conclusions added weight to the growing body of evidence that suggested something far more sinister had happened in the Newcastle home. As the case unfolded, Pennsylvania Attorney General Michelle Henry and Newcastle Police Chief Robert Salem both spoke publicly about the gravity of the situation. They described the case as one of the most disturbing they had encountered in their careers. Their statements made clear that this was not only a criminal matter, but also a failure of the systems designed to protect vulnerable children. Lawrence County Children and Youth Services and the judicial process that had allowed unsupervised visits were placed under intense scrutiny. Questions were raised about why earlier warning signs had been overlooked and why the emergency request for supervised visitation had been denied. Public pressure began to mount, demanding answers from the agencies and officials who had made those decisions. This investigation was not just about holding one individual accountable. It was about examining the larger issues that had allowed a preventable tragedy to unfold. The evidence recovered from Alicia Owen's phone and the forensic findings from the autopsy would later become central to the case against her, forming a clear timeline of intent and action. Like and share this video if you believe these systemic failures must be addressed. The more we share, the more awareness we can raise for other children. By January 2024, after months of investigation, Alicia Owens was formally arrested. She was taken into custody at her Lawrence County residence and charged with multiple offenses, including criminal homicide, attempted homicide, aggravated assault, and child endangerment. The judge denied bail, citing the seriousness of the charges and the strength of the evidence gathered against her. Owens would remain behind bars as the legal process moved forward.
This is exclusive video of Alicia Owens after the Newcastle Police Department and State Attorney General's office arrested her this morning.
At a press briefing, prosecutors described the case as one of the most troubling they had ever handled. They also confirmed that the death penalty was under consideration, though they noted that the decision would be made carefully and with full review. This announcement only amplified the public's attention on the case. Court proceedings began to take shape, but delays soon followed. A judge allowed the defense to bring in an expert witness, and shortly after, Owen's legal counsel changed, pushing the scheduled trial date of January 6, 2025, into uncertainty. For Iris's family, the delays were deeply painful. Each postponement served as a reminder that justice had not yet been fully delivered. While the court system worked through its schedule, Emily Alfera and her parents, Candace and Frank, shifted their focus toward ensuring that Iris's memory would make a difference. They established Iris's Angels, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting children and advocating for reforms in child protection laws. The group quickly garnered community support and through local fundraisers and donations, raised over $17,000 within its first year. The funds were used for child safety initiatives and to provide necessities, such as school supplies and clothing, to children in need. Iris's Angels also worked to educate the public about the importance of acting on warning signs. Emily spoke openly about her experience, explaining how she had sought supervised visitation only to be denied. She stressed that no parent should be ignored when credible safety concerns are raised. The organization began holding workshops in schools and community centers, teaching families and educators how to recognize when a child might be at risk and how to report concerns effectively. Billboards appeared throughout Lawrence County bearing Iris's photo and the words "Justice for Iris," reminding the public of why the organization existed. Vigils were held in her honor, offering a space for the community to grieve and unite behind the call for systemic reform. Local legislators were approached with proposals aimed at ensuring that emergency custody requests would be taken more seriously, and that child protection agencies would be held accountable for thorough investigations. The Alfera family's advocacy resonated with many who had faced similar struggles. Their efforts transformed personal tragedy into a movement for change, giving Iris's story the power to protect other children. Volunteers and supporters joined their mission, helping to spread awareness and drive legislative discussions. This case became more than a criminal trial. It became a symbol of how systems can fail and how communities must respond. Emily and her parents knew that nothing could bring back their daughter, but they were determined to make sure her legacy would save lives. We cover these cases not just to tell a story, but to save lives. If you believe Iris Rita Alfera's story matters, please like and share this video if you can, because every time you engage, you help push for change by letting this case reach more people, which helps to drive awareness. Your voice could be the difference that prevents another tragedy. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.
Your Worship, in front of the court, case number A985 of 16, State versus Willem Kobus Kukumoer, accused in person. Accused number 2, Louisa Cornelia Susanna Kukumoer, accused number 2, represented by Mr. Nel.
Wie wil draaien?
No bail.
She's not moving. What do we do? The voice on the other end of the phone was panicked, trembling. But by the time first responders reached the small farmhouse, it was already too late. What they saw inside would stay with them for the rest of their lives. A seasoned detective, someone who had seen more than his share of tragic scenes, had to step outside to compose himself. I thought I was hardened, he later said, but this was different. The image of a little girl, barely 3 years old, covered in marks and lying lifeless, was more than any parent or investigator could bear. What makes this case even more haunting is that it didn't come out of nowhere. There were warning signs everywhere. Bruises hidden under long sleeves, teachers asking quiet questions, neighbors making desperate calls for help. Yet each time the danger was minimized, explained away, or lost in red tape. And this wasn't an isolated family tucked away in a remote forest. This was a community where people waved to each other at the grocery store and sat together at church. The children in this family were seen, even loved by those around them. But behind closed doors, they lived in fear, and no one knew just how bad it truly was until the very worst happened. Even now, those who knew this family ask themselves the same heartbreaking question. Could this little girl have been saved if someone had just acted sooner? Or was it already too late by the time the system stepped in? This is the story of a child who deserved so much more, and of the opportunities that were missed to protect her. It is also a story about why speaking up and following through can be the difference between life and death. Before we begin, I need to warn you. What you're about to hear is deeply disturbing. But telling this story matters, because every time we shine a light on these failures, we move one step closer to preventing another tragedy like this from happening again. Please, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss cases like this, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It helps us connect with this incredible community. Poppy van der Merwe was just 3 years old at the time of her passing. She lived with her 5-year-old brother, Johan, in a household that on the surface seemed like any other. Those who saw the siblings in public often described them as bright-eyed children, shy at times, but outwardly normal. Few could have imagined the turbulence that shaped their young lives behind closed doors. To understand how the circumstances in their household developed, it is important to examine the life of their mother, Louisa Cooker. Louisa's childhood was marked by instability. She grew up in a home overshadowed by conflict and neglect. After her father died when she was young, Louisa's mother remarried a man who was known for his strict and controlling temperament. Family members would later recall that Louisa often felt unwanted and unsupported, an experience that left deep psychological scars. When Louisa reached adulthood, she was determined to leave that environment behind. At a young age, she married Freddie, a man 4 years older than her. But this relationship quickly proved toxic. Friends close to the couple later recounted frequent arguments and controlling behavior from Freddie. Louisa, unable to find the stability she craved, eventually left the marriage. Hoping to start over, she later entered a relationship with Christo van der Merwe. Christo initially appeared caring and responsible. The two settled down and started a family together. Their son, Johan, was born first, followed by their daughter Poppy 2 years later. At this point, Louisa appeared to be building the stable family life she had always wanted. But within months of Poppy's birth, the relationship deteriorated. Christo's behavior changed. He became more confrontational and unpredictable. Louisa filed for separation and eventually obtained a court order to keep him from approaching her. She retained custody of both children, though Christo was granted supervised visits a few times a month. With her marriage to Christo dissolved, Louisa sought to rebuild her life once again. In search of a fresh start, she moved with Johan and Poppy to Orania, a small, close-knit community in South Africa's Northern Cape province. Orania was known for its conservative values and its self-sufficient population. Many in the town were members of the Dutch Reformed Church, which played a significant role in the community's social structure. Neighbors knew one another by name, and new arrivals often received assistance to settle in. When Louisa arrived in Orania, members of the Dutch Reformed Church helped her secure a modest home and find a position at a local supermarket. She brought with her Marissa, the teenage daughter from one of her previous relationships. Marissa, who was 14 at the time, became a steady presence in the household and a source of comfort to Poppy and Johan. She took on a caregiver role, helping with daily routines and easing the pressure on Louisa as she adjusted to her new environment. During this period, Louisa met a man named Cobus Kokomor. Like Louisa, Cobus had a complicated personal history. He had been divorced twice and had children from previous relationships. Acquaintances later described him as quiet, reserved, and difficult to get to know. But he quickly grew close to Louisa. The relationship moved forward rapidly, and within months, Cobus proposed marriage. Louisa accepted. After their wedding in November 2015, Cobus moved into the home with Louisa, Johan, Poppy, and Marissa. However, the household dynamic changed immediately. The day after the wedding, Cobus insisted that Marissa, who had been a vital source of support for the younger children, leave the home. He put her on a bus to live with her biological father. The removal of Marissa, who had been a trusted caregiver to Johan and Poppy, left a noticeable void. This shift marked a significant change in the family's daily life. Neighbors and acquaintances would later say that the children appeared quieter and more withdrawn without Marissa's presence. Cobus, now the primary male figure in the household, set strict rules, and there was little room for discussion. Louisa, newly married and attempting to maintain the appearance of a stable family unit, complied with Cobus's decisions. By the end of 2015, the family appeared settled in Orania to outsiders. Louisa had a steady job. The children were enrolled in local programs, and they attended church regularly. But the absence of Marissa, coupled with Cobus's increasing control over the household, marked the beginning of a very different reality for Poppy and Johan, one that few in the community could see from the outside. By late 2015, the household had entered a period of strict control. Over the following months, from September 2015 through October 2016, multiple signs of concern began to emerge. Neighbors, educators, and even professionals who interacted with the family noticed patterns that were deeply troubling. Yet each sign on its own seemed to be explained away or dismissed. One of the family's neighbors, a man named Jacco Roux, would later provide some of the most critical testimony about this period. Jacco lived close enough to occasionally overhear activity from the home. He recalled incidents that alarmed him, moments that revealed an increasingly tense environment inside the house. On one occasion, during the colder months, he observed the children standing outside while being sprayed with cold water from a garden hose. The reason, he was told, was discipline. He remembered thinking that such a punishment was dangerous given the temperature, but he wasn't in a position to intervene directly. There were other instances Jacco could not forget. He often heard the children cry after wetting their beds. The sound was followed by shouting and what he described as long periods of silence afterward, leaving him uneasy. On more than one occasion, he noticed that Poppy was struggling to walk properly, appearing to limp or favor one side of her body. These moments convinced him that something was very wrong. He began raising concerns with those he thought could help, but nothing seemed to change. The concerns were not limited to the neighbors. Staff at the kindergarten attended by Johan and Poppy noticed that both children displayed clear signs of fear at pickup time. Teachers reported that Johan would sometimes hide in the bathroom or refuse to leave with his parents. They also know that Poppy often arrived dressed in long sleeves or layers even on warm days. When staff attempted to help her remove the extra clothing, she became anxious, clinging to the garments as though afraid of what would happen if she was seen without them. Educators asked questions, hoping for answers that would put their minds at ease. But the explanations they received from Louisa and Cobus were consistent and rehearsed. The children, they were told, were simply accident-prone and active. Bruises and limping, they said, were the result of falls or rough play. Without direct evidence of wrongdoing and bound by protocols that required escalation through formal channels, the staff felt powerless. Medical professionals were among those who could have intervened. Poppy and Johan were occasionally seen by doctors, but the subtle warning signs were missed or overlooked. One physician noted injuries that seemed inconsistent with typical childhood accidents, yet no formal report was filed. A minister from the family's church was also made aware of possible problems in the home. He later admitted he was conflicted about how to respond. Without definitive proof, he feared intervening would make things worse. It was only later that these missed opportunities would be fully understood. The Go Purple Foundation, a child protection organization, would ultimately file charges against professionals who had direct knowledge of the children's condition but failed to report it to law enforcement. Their view was that these individuals, by staying silent, allowed the situation to continue unchecked. The picture that emerged from these accounts was one of growing isolation and fear for the children. Each time someone tried to raise a concern, the explanation offered by Louisa and Cobus was enough to delay action. The family presented a stable image to the outside world, attending church regularly and maintaining steady employment. For many in the community, the outward appearance masked the underlying reality. But as these warning signs accumulated, neighbors and others in Orania began to sense that something was seriously wrong. The tension in the community was rising, and soon the pressure would become so intense that Louisa and Cobus disappeared from Orania without warning, leaving behind a community full of unanswered questions. After months of growing suspicion in Orania, Louisa and Cobus made a sudden decision to leave the community. There was no prior notice, no goodbyes to neighbors or church members. They simply vanished overnight. When questioned later, community members said it was as if the family had been trying to escape the watchful eyes that were beginning to focus on them. The couple relocated to a rural area near Britt, close to Hopetown, where they believed they could live without interference. The move significantly changed the children's daily lives. Johan and Poppy, who had once attended kindergarten and participated in community activities, were now cut off from structured education and regular contact with outsiders. Their world became confined to the household, with no teachers or trusted adults to notice anything amiss. This isolation removed one of the few safety nets they had, leaving them dependent on Louisa and Cobus for everything. Extended family members did notice concerning changes. During a visit, Louisa's mother saw both Johan and Poppy and was shocked by how fearful and withdrawn they appeared. She noticed signs that something was wrong and tried to raise the issue, but Louisa quickly dismissed her concerns. She insisted the children were fine and accused her mother of overreacting. Out of fear of pushing her daughter away completely, the grandmother refrained from taking further action. Neighbors in the Britt and Hopetown area began to observe troubling patterns similar to those noted in Orania. People living nearby reported hearing raised voices and the sound of children crying late at night. Some neighbors recalled seeing the children alone outside, unusually quiet and hesitant to interact. Those who tried to engage with them noticed the children rarely made eye contact and often seemed tense in the presence of adults. Reports of inappropriate boundaries in the household also surfaced. According to accounts later shared in court, Johan and Poppy were forced to share a bedroom with Louisa and Kobus, and were exposed to adult behavior that no child should witness. These details painted a picture of an environment where the children had no privacy, no sense of security, and no opportunity to escape the constant tension inside the home. Despite these warning signs, nothing was done to intervene. There were no school officials to check on the children's well-being, no medical appointments to provide opportunities for disclosure, and no strong community ties in the new area to prompt accountability. The isolation allowed Louisa and Kobus to maintain complete control over the household without outside scrutiny. As weeks turned into months, the situation worsened. Neighbors who had already raised concerns became increasingly alarmed by what they were witnessing. Their reports of children in distress became more frequent and more urgent, but without direct evidence, no decisive action was taken. The children's world had become frighteningly small. They were separated from the teachers and caregivers who had once noticed the warning signs, and even extended family members were being pushed away. This complete lack of oversight set the stage for the events that would follow. Events that would shock the country and leave a community forever questioning whether more could have been done. If this story already feels important, take a second to subscribe, because what comes next is something no child should endure. Sharing these stories helps spread awareness and protect others. On October 24, 2016, tensions in the household escalated. According to later testimony, the incident began when Kobus became frustrated with Poppy over something minor. Louisa, sensing the situation was deteriorating, asked him repeatedly to calm down and not to discipline the children. Those requests were ignored. Witness accounts presented in court and Louisa's own statements revealed that Kobus was strict and controlling in his approach. During this confrontation, Kobus became aggressive, and Poppy suffered a serious head injury. She became unusually quiet and subdued afterwards, behavior that deeply concerned Louisa. Despite these warning signs, no medical care was sought. On the morning of October 25, 2016, the atmosphere in the household was tense. Poppy, just 3 years old, appeared noticeably unwell. She was lethargic and struggled to keep up with her usual routine. Louisa, seeing her daughter's condition, was visibly concerned. She later admitted that she pleaded with Kobus not to confront or discipline the children that day, hoping to give them time to rest. Those pleas, however, went unheeded. According to witness testimony and investigative findings, Kobus maintained a strict, uncompromising approach when it came to the household. That morning was no exception. He dismissed Louisa's concerns, insisting that maintaining order and rules was more important. Louisa's reluctance to challenge him directly meant that she allowed him to continue, despite fearing the consequences. As the day went on, Poppy's condition worsened. She became weaker and struggled to stay upright. It was only when she collapsed entirely that Louisa and Kobus realized the gravity of the situation. Instead of seeking immediate help, valuable time passed before they decided to act. When they finally rushed her to the small Brit hospital later that afternoon, it was too late. Hospital staff immediately recognized the severity of the situation. Poppy had already passed away before reaching the hospital, and the attending nurses and doctors quickly realized there was nothing they could do to save her. What they observed in that examination room raised serious concerns. Her condition was inconsistent with the explanations given by Louisa and Kobus. Questions were asked, but the answers they received did not match what they were seeing. It wasn't just Poppy's condition that alarmed the staff. Johan, her 5-year-old brother, was visibly frightened. He clung to the corner of the room, avoiding eye contact and staying as far as possible from Louisa and Kobus. When approached by nurses, he appeared anxious and withdrawn, behavior that only deepened the suspicion of those present. By the time the initial assessment was complete, the medical team knew they were dealing with a situation that required law enforcement involvement. They made the call to local authorities, setting in motion an investigation that would uncover a chain of failures and decisions leading to this point. The events of that day marked the beginning of a case that would horrify the nation and force a community to confront the warning signs it had missed. The questions now shifted to how a child could have reached this point without intervention, and whether anyone could have stepped in before it was too late. When local police arrived at the hospital, they immediately understood the gravity of what they were walking into. The attending medical team had already briefed them on the inconsistencies between Poppy's condition and the explanations provided by Louisa and Cobus. Detectives knew this was no ordinary case. What they were about to uncover would reveal a pattern of neglect, missed opportunities, and systemic failures that had spanned months. Detectives began by gathering as much information as they could from hospital staff, who detailed the inconsistencies they had observed. Louisa and Cobus were questioned on site about the events leading up to Poppy's collapse. Their accounts were vague, lacking detail, and often contradicted one another. This alone was enough for investigators to treat the case as suspicious from the outset. As the investigation progressed, forensic specialists began their examinations. The findings were troubling. Poppy's injuries were not isolated to a single event. Instead, evidence showed that she had endured harm over a long period of time. There were clear signs of injuries at different stages of healing, indicating a pattern of mistreatment that predated her collapse. The forensic team determined that a severe head injury was the primary cause of her death. This injury was consistent with the events that had reportedly taken place in the household the day before. To build a clearer picture, investigators conducted interviews with individuals who had interacted with the family. Neighbor Jocko Rue provided detailed testimony about his concerns in the months prior. He recalled specific incidents where he had witnessed troubling punishments and heard cries from the children. His account corroborated the forensic findings that injuries had occurred over time. The children's grandmother was also interviewed. She described her growing alarm when she last saw Poppy and Johan, and how her attempts to raise the issue with Louisa were dismissed. Teachers from the children's former kindergarten confirmed that they, too, had noticed signs of fear and injuries that had been explained away by the parents. These interviews painted a consistent picture. The warning signs had been present for months, but the system had failed to intervene effectively. One of the most critical interviews was conducted with Johan, Poppy's 5-year-old brother. Trained child investigators met with him in a safe environment where he could share what he knew without fear. Johan described a household where strict discipline was a daily occurrence. He spoke about incidents that aligned with the injuries found during the forensic examination. His testimony gave investigators an inside view of what life had been like for both him and his sister in the months leading up to her death. With the forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, and Johan's statement, investigators had enough to take decisive action. Cobus was arrested immediately. Louisa was initially questioned further as detectives sought to determine her level of involvement. Following additional interviews and a review of the evidence, she was also taken into custody. But as the trial approached, it became clear this case was about more than two parents accused of harming a child. It was about every person and system that had failed to act in time. When the case reached the courts, it was immediately clear this would not be a straightforward trial. Attorneys in the Northern Cape were hesitant to take on the defense. Several declined outright, citing the nature of the allegations. It took weeks before legal representation could be secured for Louisa and Cobus, delaying the proceedings and underscoring the gravity of the charges they faced. The prosecution began by methodically piecing together the full timeline of events leading up to Poppy's death. Investigators presented the forensic evidence first. Detailed reports showing injuries in varying stages of healing, evidence that pointed to harm occurring repeatedly over a prolonged period. These findings were supported by medical experts who testified that the final fatal injury was consistent with a serious blow to the head. Next came the testimony of those who had seen the warning signs, but were unable, or in some cases unwilling, to intervene. Neighbor Jacques Roux took the stand and described what he had witnessed from his own property. Troubling punishments, children crying, and visible signs of fear. He recalled trying to raise concerns, but said he felt powerless when nothing was done. Teachers from the children's former kindergarten followed. They spoke about Johann and Poppy's withdrawn behavior in the classroom, their reluctance to go home, and the visible marks they had observed. When asked why they did not escalate the matter further, some admitted they had believed the explanations given by Louisa and Cobus at the time. The grandmother's testimony was one of the most poignant. She described her deep unease the last time she saw the children alive, and her regret over not taking stronger action. Her account gave the court an intimate glimpse of how the family had become isolated from those who might have been able to help. Judge Bert Bam presided over the trial and listened intently as the evidence mounted. He remarked during the proceedings that the case had to be viewed as a mosaic of evidence. Each piece on its own might not have been enough, but together they formed an undeniable picture of what had happened. He described Louisa and Cobus as inherently evil, noting their complete lack of remorse and their failure to protect Poppy even when given countless opportunities to do so. Louisa's legal team attempted to mitigate her role, arguing that she was a product of her own abusive upbringing and had been controlled by Cobus. She claimed that she had been unable to stop him and that fear had dictated her actions. The judge, however, was unmoved. He pointed out that Louisa had multiple chances to intervene, to seek help for her children, or to remove them from danger. In May 2018, Judge Bam delivered his verdict. Both Louisa and Cobus were found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Each also received an additional 10 years for child abuse charges, sentences that would run concurrently with their life terms. The judge made it clear that their actions, or in Louisa's case, her inaction, had directly led to Poppy's death, and that the maximum penalty was the only appropriate response. The trial may have ended with Louisa and Cobus receiving life sentences, but the fight for accountability was far from over. In the months that followed, the Go Purple Foundation, one of South Africa's most active child protection organizations, took a bold stand. They refused to let the story end there. After carefully reviewing the evidence presented in court, the foundation uncovered a disturbing reality. There were multiple professionals, people who had seen the warning signs with their own eyes, who had never escalated their concerns. Teachers, a doctor, even a church minister. All of them had crossed paths with Poppy and Johann in the months before her death, and all had opportunities to raise the alarm. Yet none had done so in time. In December 2017, the foundation filed formal charges against these individuals, accusing them of failing to meet their mandatory reporting duties. It was an extraordinary move, one that sent a powerful message across the country. Accountability doesn't stop with the perpetrators. If a child's life is in danger, silence can be just as damaging. For the Go Purple Foundation, this was about more than one case. Their campaign called for stricter laws, stronger training, and a cultural shift that would empower teachers, doctors, and clergy to act when they suspect a child is at risk. Their message was clear. Protecting children requires vigilance from everyone, not just the people inside the home. By the time the legal process concluded, the case had become a national wake-up call. Communities across South Africa were asking themselves hard questions. How did this happen? How could so many adults see the warning signs and still fail to act? And most importantly, what would it take to make sure it never happens again? The emotional toll of the case was perhaps felt most deeply by Poppy's biological father, Christo van der Merwe. He had long been separated from Louisa and had limited contact with his children, but the news of Poppy's death devastated him. During the investigation, audio recordings of phone calls he had shared with his daughter were revealed. In these calls, Poppy's voice carried a tenderness that deeply moved everyone who heard it, a reminder of a bond that had been strained by distance and circumstance. Christo spoke openly about his regret and grief, expressing that he would never be able to undo the separation that had kept him from his children. In the months following the trial, Christo became an outspoken advocate for stronger child protection laws. He participated in awareness campaigns, speaking at community events, and urging parents and professionals to act when they suspect a child may be in danger. His voice became a powerful reminder that failing to step in can have irreversible consequences. The small community of Orania, where the family had once lived, also struggled to come to terms with the tragedy. Many of its members felt a deep sense of guilt, questioning whether they could have done more when they noticed the warning signs. That guilt turned into anger for some. Before Poppy's funeral, a vigilante attack was carried out on Luisa by individuals posing as police officers. The incident shocked the public, further reflecting the raw emotions the case had stirred. Despite this, the community channeled its grief into pushing for better awareness of child safety issues. Churches, schools, and local organizations began hosting workshops on mandatory reporting laws and how to recognize signs of neglect or harm. Community leaders made a collective effort to ensure no other child would go unnoticed or unheard. This movement of accountability and reform marked a turning point. While nothing could undo the loss, the case had ignited a determination among families and professionals alike to act swiftly and decisively if they ever encountered a similar situation. The case of Poppy van der Merwe revealed the devastating impact of systemic failures. Multiple people and institutions had opportunities to step in, but each missed moment allowed the situation to continue unchecked. Teachers noticed changes in the children's behavior, but accepted explanations given to them. Medical professionals observed injuries, but did not escalate their concerns. A church minister became aware of possible problems, but chose to remain silent. These lapses, combined with insufficient communication between agencies, ultimately left Poppy without the protection she needed. The lesson from this case is clear. Hidden dangers can exist even in environments that seem safe and familiar. Children are often harmed by those they know and trust, making it all the more important for communities to be vigilant. Recognizing subtle warning signs, withdrawal, unexplained injuries, fear of going home is critical. Just as important is the willingness to act, even when doing so feels uncomfortable or inconvenient. The public outcry following the trial prompted renewed calls for reform. Child protection organizations pushed for stricter training for teachers, healthcare providers, and clergy, emphasizing the legal and ethical responsibility to report suspected harm immediately. The Go Purple Foundation's decision to lay charges against professionals who failed to act was a significant step toward reinforcing those responsibilities. Awareness campaigns spread through schools and community centers, teaching adults how to identify and respond to potential dangers. Some regions strengthened their reporting mechanisms, ensuring that concerns could be escalated quickly and that agencies could work together more effectively. But this case also served as a reminder that no law or policy can replace the role of an engaged and observant community. Every adult has a part to play in protecting children. Speaking up can be difficult, but silence can have devastating consequences. What changes do you believe need to happen so no child slips through the cracks? Share your thoughts in the comments. We do read them. And subscribe to help us continue raising awareness for children who need a voice.